I'm going to ask two quick questions, and then we'll open it up and allow the panel to talk among themselves. My first question concerns BDS. I'd like you to start with it, Matthew. You know, I've expressed real concern that anti-Semitism and hate of Israel is coming into Congress. But on the other hand, the House recently passed a resolution condemning the BDS movement, which was opposed by certain members of Congress. Does this give us hope that maybe that Democratic members of Congress understand this problem, and maybe there's something we can do to fight off anti-Semitism from coming into Congress?
Well, if the question is, does the Democrat side understand this for the House? I mean, that verdict is still out. However, what we're seeing now, the trend lines, as I think has already been pointed out here, are certainly not encouraging. It seems to, the squad has hijacked the talking points, but not just the talking points. As you can see, how the legislation itself in the House was a watered-down version of what was already in the Senate, which I believe Nancy Pelosi, frankly, I'm pretty sure she didn't have a problem with, or many in the caucus many Democrats didn't have a problem with the harder definition that would target, push back against the BDS movement. So I think we're seeing essentially the lurching further to the left in the Democrat Party, and it's being hijacked by that. We'll see how that is essentially going to play out. It's kind of like I look back at what happened when Trump was elected president. There was the internal divisions within the Republican Party that had to be sorted out. Well, Democrats at this point seem to be 4 to 6 years behind where Republicans are, except for this is actually a sinister movement in which they're going to have to deal with it themselves, because Republicans seem fairly unified on this matter. Democrats, that still remains to be seen.
Can I offer even more pessimistic assessment? And that is, what this actually, I think, reflects is a real transformation in American foreign policy, which is the American attitudes towards the state of Israel, which traditionally, for years of foreign policy in the Congress and the right and left, support for Israel is relatively bipartisan. I mean, and although there are always detractors on both sides, but in the mainstream, it was completely non-controversial in the U.S. Congress to support the bilateral relationship between U.S. and Israel. That's starting to change, where we're actually seeing the political parties adapt in their partisan political platforms different attitudes towards the state of Israel. And a major contributor to that really has been, I think, the transformation of the American Jewish communities, which in many ways was always a firebreak. It was a glue that really kind of held both sides together. And it goes back to the issue that you talked about, which is kind of the transformation of the American Jewish community, which has become increasingly more secular, increasingly more liberal, and an increasingly smaller force in the American electorate. And the result of that is getting kind of dragged into this BDS movement. It has it has kind of fallen behind a more progressive Democratic Party, which has now found itself going down the road of viewing Israel not as the ally that we respect on both sides, but as an issue to debate with the right over. And that is really problematic. If nowhere else, it's more, I think, problematic for Democrats, because conversely, ironically, and nobody knows this issue better than Fred, there is a bit of a consensus in the United States about what is the great problem in the region, and that is Iran. Left and right agree on that. They don't agree on the Iran deal, and again, nobody's a bigger expert on that than Fred, so they have disputes about how to handle Iran, but everybody in America, I mean, in the political, by and large, recognizes that Iran is the great threat to American policy in the Middle East. It has to be dealt with. This creates a real problem for Democrats, who then are abandoning the most important ally in the region that we need to work with to contain Iran.
Yeah. May I say, the BDS movement is predicated on gigantic propaganda, Orwellian lies. We found on campuses that many of the kids who are not bad kids believe in BDS because they believe the lies. They believe that there is an occupation. Occupation means someone has stolen someone else's sovereign land. Of course, there was never a country called Palestine. Even the word Palestine is a Roman name. If there was an Arab country, Palestine, why did they use a Roman name? And there's no occupation. Israel's given away all of Gaza, 40% of Judea and Samaria. That's where 99% of the Palestinian Arabs live. They have their own parliaments, their own schools, their own textbooks, their own police, their own businesses. They run their lives completely except security. And the only reason Israel has to share in security is because terrorist cells in the Palestinian areas continue to evolve to want to come into Israel to kill Jews. Secondly, settlements. They believe that Israel's built settlements on 80% of Judea and Samaria. When they find out the truth, that the Jewish communities of Judea and Samaria comprise less than 2% of the West Bank of Judea and Samaria, they're in shock. And they're in shock that there's not been a single new Jewish community settlement built since Oslo began in '93. The only building that's occurred is within the boundaries of the existing communities there in 1993 when Oslo began, and also statehood. The people are shocked to find out that Israel has offered a state to the Palestinian Authority at least 3 times in the last 19 years, rejected every time without a counteroffer, and they've been offered a state 7 times in the last 80 years, starting with the Peel Commission in 1937, and then the UN Resolution 181 in 48, and they rejected it every time because it meant accepting Israel as a Jewish state and saying there'll be no further claims. Proof that the issue is not land or statehood, it's Israel's absolute destruction. And the final issue, they believe, is why isn't Israel offering to give away parts of Jerusalem? Well, the truth is, and this is a truth that people do not like to talk about, if Jerusalem is so holy to Muslims, why on earth is it that in their holy book, the Quran, the word Jerusalem is never mentioned, not a single time? And why is it when they controlled Jerusalem, the most important parts of Jerusalem, between 48 and 67, did they allow it to become a slum? Did they make Amman their capital? There was virtually no water, running water, no electricity, no plumbing in Jerusalem when the Arabs controlled it. Not a single Arab leader, except for Jordanian leaders, ever visited Jerusalem when they controlled it, because it's really not holy to them. And those are the things I think have to be promoted by those who care about the truth, those who care about Israel, that the whole BDS movement is propagated on an outrageous, propagandistic, Orwellian lies.
Rabbi, do you have thoughts on this?
I think that the panelist from the Heritage said something that's very important, that we're seeing how the Jewish community is transferring over and with their less electorate power. I think that I just saw a op-ed in the New York Times yesterday where actually it just kind of segues into what happened just now in the Israeli elections, that everybody's kind of confused about what's going on over there. But one thing is certain is that one of the major issues that has been going on between the American Jewish community, specifically the liberal progressive segment of it, and Israel, there's been this sort of wedge between both communities, and it's kind of been blamed on Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, for being a right-wing hawk. But the op-ed in the New York Times, which was written by a liberal progressive, is saying that he thinks that even with Benny Gantz, if he becomes the prime minister, this is going to act, he's saying it's a bad thing that Benny Gantz won, because the now American Jewry is going to learn that they don't really like Israel at all.
Right.
And that they're going to find that Benny Gantz is not going to be that much different on a policy level than Benjamin Netanyahu. And that, to him, was a cause of concern, because that means that finally American liberal Jews who don't have really much of a connection with Israel and have, I guess you could say, truly assimilated into their liberal progressive American culture, don't look at Israel as a priority anymore, which really boils down to something that my grandfather used to speak about, which is truly a total degeneration of their Jewish pride and of understanding of their Jewish history. And like, at the end of the day, you have to remember that the treatment of Jews is the canary in the coal mine for every civilization in history. And when Jews are just totally ignoring that, it's an alarming factor.
You know, I mentioned earlier that President Trump has been maybe the most pro-Israel president ever, and has been extremely supportive of the Jewish community. At the same time, he's been criticized for his close relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu. I wonder if the panel would like to comment on how the Trump administration has been doing, and what more might it do to address this issue of anti-Semitism and supporting the U.S.-Israel relationship.
I'd be happy to start. I think there's a profoundly, like the most professional word I could think of is scary thing going on in the world. So we've entered what's now called the era of great power competition. So in theory, the focus of U.S. power protecting its interests in the world is really kind of dealing with the countries that have the authority and capacity to really challenge that. And that includes China, Iran, Russia, because it has nuclear weapons, North Korea. But one of the interesting products of that competition has been how the issue of freedom and human rights can be completely perverted or really whitewashed, and oftentimes it is the liberal voices in the Western world which are actually participants and enablers of this process. So we had a great discussion here about anti-Semitism and about how the BDS movement has essentially weaponized Western human rights against a people, in not protecting human values, but essentially been turned to the destruction of the religious liberty of the Jewish people. We've seen the same thing with the Uyghurs. Here you have over a tenth of the Uyghur population in China, over 1 million people thrown into camps, completely extraditional, nothing to do with the Chinese legal system. And you have not only the Western world, but most of the Arab world completely silent to this unbelievable religious atrocity. How could that be possible? Well, the answer is easy, because nobody wants to upset China. And so here we have to, I think, really look at ourselves as a Western civilization and culture. And I don't know what the Jewish word is on this, but like, where's our backbone? Where's our heart? Where's our soul? Where's our guts that we let people, turn us against the Jewish people? That we let people turn a blind eye to a tremendous atrocity? Even as look, I mean, the hypocrisy here is incredible. Places like this, the Center for Security Policy have been attacked over and over again for being anti-Muslim, right? And yet, here's the greatest atrocity against Muslims of the modern time, right? 1 million people thrown in prison, and people don't care. There's more discussion about the plight of Uyghurs here. You hate Muslims, and you care. I mean, because you don't. Because you cherish this notion of religious liberty. And to tie this back to the administration, if you strip away the tweeting and the yelling and the screaming and everything else, and you actually look at U.S. government policy, one of the stellar focuses of this administration has been the promotion of religious liberty and combating religious persecution. And the lodestars of that campaign have been combating anti-Semitism, bringing attention to the plight of Christians in the Middle East, and bringing attention to the what's been perpetrated against the Uyghurs in Asia.
With respect to President Trump, not only has he moved the embassy, and by the way, when the embassy law was passed in '95, Senator John Kyle and Newt Gingrich were the two principal people. We at ZOA, I'm proud to say, were involved from the very beginning. The Jewish groups were initially against this, saying this will ruin the peace process, that if you don't move it, you'll get to peace. Well, it wasn't moved for over 20 years, and of course there was no peace, so the Jewish leadership was completely wrong. But not only has Trump done the things that Fred Fleitz has mentioned, he stopped funding UNRWA, an organization that promotes vicious hatred, even violence against Jews. He stopped funding the United Nations Human Rights Commission, that almost every one of their resolutions are anti-Israel. When the Taylor-Force Act was passed, and by the way, I have to say, for 1 year, it was not voted on, it wasn't passed, and AIPAC has refused to get on that bill for a year. You'll have to ask them why, but they only got on it when the bill was weakened after a year, where the Palestinian Authority would not initially they were going to lose all of the $450–500 million funding from the U.S. if they didn't change their law that pays Arabs to murder Jews. And the more Jews an Arab murders, the higher their pension and salary for the rest of their life. And then it was passed where they would only lose 1/3 of the money that America gets. But President Trump said, I don't care. I'm not giving them any more money. He cut out all the money, even though Taylor Force only required 1/3. And look at President Trump's appointments. The most incredibly pro-Israel people who understand the truth of the Arab-Islamic war against Israel in the West. John Bolton, Pompeo, Nikki Haley, Mr. O'Brien, who now has just been appointed, Rick Grenell, the ambassador to Germany, the most important European country, Michael Pence, the vice president. You can't get more pro-Israel than Mike Pence. So we have the Jews and those who are pro-Israel, like evangelical Christians, have to appreciate that President Trump has been wildly, not only pro-Israel, but understanding of the dangers Israel faces from the Arab Islamic world.
Thank you.
If I could touch on a few other characteristics here. One thing that President Trump has stressed, and I believe even at the General Assembly just today, is to push for full Arab-Israeli normalization. Now, that is something that would be huge and needs to happen, hopefully more on the surface than behind the scenes. That is something that would do more than most other symbolic type of acts if it happens in reality. And of course, with the understanding that Iran is in fact the main problem that is focusing Israeli and most of the Arab attention in that direction, it's Iran, this is a great time to do it, which of course is something that happened by accident with started with President Obama making the painfully horrible JCPOA. But something else that President Trump has realized is the importance of the culture war. Frankly, when you see him at his best, when he is in the culture war, and this is actually important because what we're seeing in the BDS movement, of course, how it works in the West is that it's a part of progressive lefty ideology now. So he doesn't mind having that battle. And at the same time, his people that he has from the White House working on the peace process have worked very hard to push back against mythology, because in the end, a lot of this with the culture war and with the peace process dealing with the Middle East in general is about pushing back on mythology. They remember history, but it's what they've pretty much invented, and boy, is it transmitted well. So pushing back on the idea that, well, Palestine is a state that's existed forever, or the return of refugees, or just the idea that I laid out in how BDS works, that this is just about 1967 issues, occupation. No, it's 1948 issues. It's Israel's existence is important. So I think what President Trump has done, it's not just, receiving a list from someone of, well, these are the things that would make a specific group happy, or, these are things on the list to get done. He actually has understood the soup that it's in, and how to basically get to the root of it, which is something that, as we were discussing before, is really going to play out over the coming years.
Mr. Brodsky mentions the refugee issue. It's so important to note, I know Mr. Brodsky knows this, Resolution 194 that was passed that said that refugees, so-called Arab refugees, should be allowed to come into Israel. Every Arab country voted against that resolution. Why? Because it said they can only come back to Israel after the Arab countries make peace with Israel. And the Arabs didn't give a damn about the refugees, and they weren't about to make peace with Israel, so every one of them voted against that resolution. Here they are screaming how important refugees are.
They tend to like something that was previous and then is no longer on the table. In fact, a very famous prince from a Middle Eastern country said that to Arafat on the way to see President Clinton in the Oval Office to get the famous Clinton parameters was, whenever we always say no, whenever we say no, there's always something less that's available later. Isn't it time that we should say yes? And
I want to get Rabbi Moskowitz into this, but I first want to embarrass him a little bit by praising his participation at a panel the center did at CPAC 19 earlier this year. And the title of this is why anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are threats to U.S. national security. The rabbi spoke at this panel, and he was like a rock star. He held court for 20 minutes afterwards with all the people. And this is a standing room only panel. If you want to see his remarks at this, you can see them at our website, securefreedom.org. But anyway, after embarrassing you for this, do you have any thoughts on this question?
First of all, I had such a high from it. I want to know if we're going to do it again this year at CPAC. But speaking of the president, I know that, again, this is just going back into the theme of like what I've been speaking about before. The president has done so much for Israel and so much for the Jewish people. I was once with him in a room and we were talking about it, him and I actually mentioned to the president that he said to me, "So you like that I moved the embassy in Jerusalem to Jerusalem?" And I was like, "Mr. President, that's not the only thing that I like as a Jew that you've done. I mean, I love that what you're doing with protecting religious freedoms. I'm seeing, if anybody, I highly recommend people watch his speech that he spoke about in the UN. I like what he's doing on the education front that helps alleviate pressure for Jewish families. I like what he's doing to combat anti-Semitism, and the list goes on and on. Mainly we were speaking about the Taylor Force Act, things of how the administration can continue talking about that. The Chovei Tzion, the organization I'm the president of, is an affiliate of Young Israel. The president of the National Council of Israel, Farley Weiss, was like very instrumental in helping with the initial movement on that bill. The thing is that Jason Greenblatt was doing so much amazing work on social media, constantly educating the world on what's going on, and the administration has to continue doing that. Jason leaving now is an unfortunate situation, but the administration could continue educating the world. They have this platform that they can educate the world. The same token, I'm also thinking about like the post-Iran, like hopefully we will be able to solve this Iran issue. God willing, we all want that to happen. Normalization with the Arab world cannot be contingent on Iran. It has to be contingent on normalization for the sake of normalization. And the U.S. administration can do a lot to help propagate that by educating the Arab world and helping them facilitate within their own culture reformation, that they're able to come to terms with the reality on the ground, that looking at Israel not only as an ally for the sake of combating Iran, but also for the sake of just the idea of cultural diversity and the ability to interact with each other. Part of that is, in my opinion, recognizing Israel as a sovereign state. And with that, I don't know, none of us really know what the deal of the century is going to be, but obviously the administration should be trying to do whatever they can to evaluate what has not worked thus far and consider promoting sovereignty, Jewish sovereignty over the land of Israel, with obviously some sort of arrangement with the local Arabs, with maybe an autonomy, so to speak, arrangement. Chovei Tzion, we've been with several other organizations we're the only Orthodox organization that has been promoting on the Hill sovereignty, and we've started to work with some of our partners, hopefully, to continue to promote this idea that the Jewish people are a sovereign nation and deserve a sovereign state in the region. And I believe that by educating the U.S. public about that, we can help further the normalization within the region as well.
Can I just offer one follow-up thought to that? Because it gets back to another thing this administration has done well, is for so many decades, American presidents, when they came in office, were told nothing can get done unless we solve the Jewish-Palestinian problem. Everything else has to be put on hold. The linkage, right? And magically, if you solve this problem, everything else will blossom, right? And this president tested that proposition, and I think he's demonstrably proven that was a silly idea, right? Of course. That the region is progressing not because we can't solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem. The region is not progressing because the region has lots of problems, right? What the Iranian situation has done is it has, I think, forced an enormous amount of Arab introspection, and I do think that there is a possibility that one is we could actually see a real security relationship develop between Israel and the Arab states out of necessity. But having kind of broken that glass, you could see where that could metastasize into all kinds of economic and other connections and tethers for a couple of reasons. One is, one of the things the Arab states really need to unleash their economic growth is they need real innovation, right? They need real connectivity, right? And Israel's the little engine that could, right? Israel is right in their own backyard. They have a state which could be a catalyst for the entire region in terms of economic transformation, economic freedom. And there's incentives for them to do that. And part of that is the encroachment of China, right? What's the alternative to the Chinese coming into your region and taking over? And the answer is you develop your own capacity to kind of be a economic bloc that we're, in a sense, immunize yourself against for the Chinese. So in the Middle East's own self-interest, it's kind of time for them to get their act together. And so I agree with you that normalization can happen on the back of the Iran deal, but there is a window that might have been created here which could start that process. And I think the policies of this administration, both in pressing back against Iran, not tethering all progress in the region to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and engaging in constructive, engaging with the Egyptians, engaging with these other countries, even not giving up on ties with Turkey, right? Willing to be a partner there to help nurture the belong, not to kind of say we're going to come in and protect you guys. You guys have to feed yourselves, but we are a partner in that. I'm not a political guy. I'm not completely nonpartisan, but I think 6 or 7 more years of that policy that could actually bear fruit.
But I think that the litmus test for this would be the relationship between Israel and Jordan.
Absolutely.
And the relationship between Israel and Jordan, although there is a lot of security collaboration, unfortunately it's not been able to transfer into a personal relationship, to the point that when the administration did the gas deal, they had to do it through an American intermediary because the Jordanians were not willing to buy directly from the Israelis' gas. And it will be the same case right now over water rights, which are becoming a contentious issue because of the Sea of Galilee having an impending ecological disaster. So you could end up with a situation where the Jordanians literally are not interested in buying water from Israel, and that's going to be an issue. So from my perspective, I would like to see the Jordanians and the Israelis having a better relationship. And until that doesn't happen, I just don't see how that will be able to evolve anywhere else.
I take your point. And what do the Jordanians really bring to the table? It's an enormous amount of human capital. And what do you need to really leverage that capital?
Yeah, 100%.
They have to integrate in the region.
100%.
I'm more hopeful with some of the Gulf states, monarchies.
Yeah, right.
I'm much more hopeful there. I'm usually pessimistic in general, notwithstanding my legislation comment before. But I think that there's a reason to be hopeful of that going forward. I think the new generation understands quite well that oil is not going to be the way to fuel their economy, and they understand that they need to do what Israel's done, which is to innovate. And when you look around, you see Israel as a giant beacon of innovation. And
if I could just take that one step forward, what does this mean for the American left? So if Israel integrates into the region, right, and essentially silliness there stops, what does that mean for the American left? And I think we could see a fracturing of the American left, because between people who are committed to these really extremist agendas, can they really exist in a party which in some sense wants to be tethered to reality? And I'm not sure they can.
That's why it's still part of that
I hope you're right.
the culture war thing.
I wanted to respond to some things you said, Jim, about the Iran nuclear deal. I've done a lot of research on this for the center, and there's a number of things that need to be pointed out concerning this move to the left by the Democratic Party and what I think is clear hatred of Israel. Bear in mind that the nuclear deal with Iran was implemented over the objections of the Israeli government with no input from this government, and you've heard Netanyahu repeatedly condemn it. But what's worth noting is that there are strong arguments being made by the left right now that we can live with a nuclear Iran. And why can't Iran have nuclear weapons? Because Israel does. I mean, that may sound really ridiculous, but Paul Pillar, who used to be a CIA officer, he's a leftist professor at Georgetown, he wrote an article on why we can live with a nuclear Iran in the National Interest a few years ago. I think it's worth noting that as the Democratic Party becomes more radical, as these radical socialists and people with anti-Israel sentiment get into the party, there's going to be a thinking here that really is against our national interests, against the interests of Israel, people who somehow think that we can live with an Iran armed with nuclear weapons. And I think that was really behind this terrible nuclear deal that Obama's administration put forward that never really stopped Iran from pursuing nuclear weapons, had a very short timeline, and Iran was easily able to cheat on because the verification was so weak. So I think when we think about this surge to the left and this surge in anti-Semitism and hatred of Israel in the Democratic Party, it really does have pretty dire implications for American and international security.
When you have a country like Iran that publicly proclaims and repeatedly death to America, death to Israel, that's not a country you want to allow them to have nuclear weapons.
Exactly.
You wouldn't want Nazi Germany to have nuclear weapons. Yes, there's a big difference between Israel and France and others having nuclear weapons in Iran. Israel is not threatening anyone, doesn't proclaim even verbally to threaten anyone, and Iran does. We should have learned from the 30s and 40s, in the Nazi Germany years, that when a country makes public threats of that nature, you better believe them. And that's why, God forbid, we do not allow Iran to have nuclear weapons, just like we would never have allowed, God forbid, for Nazi Germany to have had nuclear weapons.
Another aspect of the public garbage that's associated with that type of thinking is if Israel is assumed to have had a nuclear weapon since the late 1960s, it sparked no nuclear arms race.
Right.
The idea that Iran could have a nuclear weapon, boy, that scares the pants off of everyone in the region. So clearly, one country is...
Because they know they would use it.
I mean, and they openly declare, right? So this is obviously the main animating problem of the region today, one of them.
And I think, fundamentally, I think that's the one issue that many of us fear, right? The problem with a nuclear Iran. I mean, the mullahs aren't crazy. But if Iran has a nuclear weapon, it's not Israel that's the problem. Do people really think that Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Egypt are going to stand by and let Iran have nuclear dominance over them? That's not going to happen. And essentially, this will be not just when we have a highly proliferated region. This will be the death of the non-proliferation. It will be. It'll just be the death.
And this is the existential issue that is facing Israel today. At the end of the day, it's all about what's the Trump administration going to do next? What are we going to do? What if a Democrat is elected? What if we just get back into the deal and stick our head in the sand, pretend it's going to work?
Yeah, and not to say nice things about Fred, because I never do that, but both in government and at CSP, the one, I think, the lodestar of your research has always been, don't lose sight of what the real policy issue is here. Is a nuclear-armed Iran is not just a danger to the United States, it's a global danger, and it cannot be permitted. And if anything, I think JPCO accelerated the threat, it didn't diminish it.
That's right. Look, a nuclear Iran is an existential threat to the state of Israel. And Mort is exactly right. Iran is a state sponsor of terror. That's why Iran can never be allowed to get nuclear weapons. And frankly, the Obama administration was going to let them get these weapons. There's no question about that. This deal was such a joke. They tried to get a deal because they wanted to have a big celebration, a legacy agreement for Barack Obama. It was a catastrophe, and one of the best things President Trump did was to get us out of this fraudulent agreement. And you can see how all the Democrats are trying to fight back now that this is really a good deal, that we should try to get back in on it. Fortunately, Iran is saving us from ourselves, from its recent behavior, including firing cruise missiles at Saudi oil facilities and its other provocations. I think the Europeans are running out of patience in trying to stay in this agreement. But I think we have to think of the trend line here, where this came from and where the Democratic Party and the left is moving us in national security.
Yeah, not only is it, I'm sorry, I was going to say, not only is it a bad deal, but the arms import waivers, they expire next year, right? So if something isn't done, things could get a lot worse.
I think it's important. Yeah. I have a fear, I hope I'm wrong, that once, with God's help, we resolve this Iran nuclear danger, where Obama even said himself publicly, after 13 years, Iran can do whatever they want in terms of their nuclear program. Quite shocking. I'm worried that once that's resolved, hopefully it will be, will the Muslim world revert back to their overt hostility to Israel? I say this because traditional Islam remains the fundamental problem. Why you have, in the Middle East, 75 to 95% of the Muslims are anti-Semitic according to Pew's own polls. It's because traditional Islam preaches hatred of Christians, Jews, and until that's resolved, we will have a hotbed of danger in the Middle East. Ayaan Hirst Ali, the former Muslim who's a scholar at Stanford University's Hoover Institute, has publicly stated repeatedly, it is Islam that taught her to hate Jews and Christians and the West. And I must say, President Sisi, who I met with 2 years ago in Cairo, the president of Egypt, said publicly at Al-Azhar University, the mainstream West Point of the Islam world, he said this: "It is inconceivable," said al-Sisi, "that the thinking, the wrong ideas that we Muslims hold most sacred should cause the entire Islamic nation to be a source of anxiety, danger, killing, and destruction," said al-Sisi, "for the rest of the world. Impossible. That thinking is antagonizing the whole world. We are in need of a religious revolution. You imams are responsible before Allah. The entire world is waiting. What a courageous statement by a Muslim leader of a Muslim country at Al-Azhar University, that part of the problem is traditional Islam and its preachings. They have to have a revolution, just like the Christians had a revolution in the 60s with their hateful language that they used to preach back in those days.
I think you have reason to hope on this regard when it comes to this reformation. Again, when it comes to Saudi Arabia or the UAE, I think when it comes to Turkey, Muslim Brotherhood promotion, I think when it comes to Qatar, far more problematic. But that is part of I'm still hopeful that this can move forward, because the current model I think they're beginning to become aware is not going to work, both economically, culturally, religiously. So, I mean, we'll see. I said two optimistic things.
No,
this is just not me.
Just back to the administration, where and which Fred was part of, and I give him a lot of credit for help guiding these policies. But America's been really, since the 70s, kind of with bipolar, right? We jump in with 2 feet in the Middle East, then we try to jump out with 2 feet, right? And this is the first administration which I think really has come up with a realistic policy that says, look, we have to stay engaged with the region, right? Because it's in our interests and we can be a force for good. On the other hand, we can't solve their problems and we shouldn't try to. And I just think that balance is not just right, but the time for that is right. So I am optimistic. Those optimistic and Middle East don't normally go together.
No,
but I am. I do feel like that there's a space here that can be worked if this administration just stays on this course. And this is why I think this issue that you brought up today is so important, because what we have here is really, like the old movies, the guys are they're trying to take the track away, right? So the train will just run off the track. And that's fundamentally what the BDS movement is. They don't want this to work. They don't want people to be at peace and to love each other. They want the hate to continue. And the only way they can do that is to derail the train.
What I see is that the debate in this country is confused with condemnations of white supremacists and the far right, and I condemn these things without reservation. But this is diverting us from a real surge in anti-Semitism, including in New York City, which is much worse than you would know, and it is not being reported in the press. And as I said, this is not just a religious liberty issue. This is an effort to delegitimize the American relationship with Israel, to hurt Israel, not just to hurt the Jewish people and American Jews. So, no one wants to say that, but the center under Frank Gaffney has a tradition of saying things that people don't want to hear and talking about politically incorrect things, and this is our politically incorrect topic for today. I think we've kept you out of the discussion for the last few minutes, Rabbi. I thought I'd give you a chance to weigh in.
Well, I'm just fascinated listening to all the wonderful comments here. I think that just to follow up on their comments, I think that both sides are right, that there is a lot of optimism, but at the same time, we definitely need to see a reformation, and it has to come hand in hand. If we don't see one, the other side statistically is just not going to probably work out. And I think that those who are optimistic, I think that they do obviously hope that there will be a reformation. And I think that there are people out there like Imam Tawhidi who are promoting this kind of new Islam, and I'm all for it. I mean, if they can pull that off, then it would be amazing for everybody in the world. But at the same time, the pessimist in me is a skeptic, a little bit skeptical, a little bit. I don't know if I shared it with you. I shared with you my grandfather's writings from when he wrote 1 Minute to Midnight, and it's kind of like regurgitating the same ideas, just a couple words switched from 30 years ago. So it's very hard to see has anything really changed. But at the same time, we have to continue fighting. That's the most important thing.
Matthew, final thought before we wrap up?
Look, I just would say thank you again for hosting this. This is incredibly important. The timing is incredibly important. I think one thing that he said that's incredibly important when it comes to our own Jewish faith is tikkun olamism, which is essentially hijacked a good portion of our religion and has become a substitute for the religion itself. And this explains a large problem that we ourselves need to address. And I mean, I'm surprised myself to have been optimistic on 2 occasions involving the Middle East, because I always say that no one makes money betting on peace in the Middle East. But we shall see.
Thank you.